It's Britney, bitch.
And Iraq, everywhere like such as.
I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Out, Charlie! Out!
Our next door neighbors are foreign countries.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Remember Shuffle. My name is Ben. With me as always is my co-host Giordano.
What's up?
And today we are joined by a 2000s expert, Colette Shade. Say hi, Colette.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
Yeah.
What a treat it was to read your book, by the way. I'm never quite sure when we do these collaborations how that's going to go, but I devoured it over a couple plane rides. It was so good. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I'm so glad. I really hope that it's a book that people have fun with, even though it has a lot of information in it. I want people to really enjoy it and have some laughs too, hopefully.
Just for reference for our audience, Colette has written a book called Y2K, and it is about our favorite decade here on Remember Shuffle, the 2000s. And it sort of weaves pop culture with personal experience. And even as someone who spends 20 hours a week in the 2000s for the last 2.5 years, I found it to have so much rich information that I had never heard of before. It was really enlightening.
Yeah, Colette, what is your definition of the Y2K era? Now that we are so fully into the nostalgia cycle, people are throwing Y2K theme parties like they used to do at 90s parties. How do you define this time period?
Yeah, so I define it as 1997 through 2008. That is roughly the dot-com bubble, which technically began in 1995, but and I'll get into this later, basically the cultural effects didn't start to show up in fashion and music, etc., until around 1997. Media as well. 1997 is when Wired magazine ran a cover story that said basically that the next 25 years were going to be peaceful and prosperous. Unquestionably. And so that's when it starts. And then 2008, it ends with the financial crisis. So basically, it's the time between two bubbles with 9/11 in the middle.
That era is so funny because we've done an episode on the 2000 election, Al Gore versus George Bush, and much of the rhetoric around the election was basically nothing bad will ever happen to us.
Yeah, so who cares? They're the same guy. Right. It was the least exciting election maybe in American history.
Yeah, it really got saved by that dramatic finish with the contested election.
Yeah.
Otherwise, America truly flipped a coin.
Yes.
And we were laughing thinking about how Trump had positioned the state of America in 2016, which I think was Crippled America was his title for it. And so to go from nothing bad will ever happen to us till everything is ruined, what happened in that intervening time?
Right. Well, that's what I have a book about. So
Yeah. What was the impetus behind writing this book? What made you want to write about this decade in particular?
Well, so around 2017, 2018, 2019, I was feeling really, really nostalgic. And part of that was, I think, getting older. I'm 36 now. I just turned 30 in 2018. Part of that was just things in the world were going really badly with Trump, with climate change, with inequality and various other downer things that were happening. And everything felt really chaotic. And then my own life was kind of a mess. Not great things had happened in my personal life. And my career was really kind of in the toilet. And I was just like, God, I wish I could just get in a time machine and go back to 1999 and put on some body glitter and listen to Mambo Number 5 and just not care about this scary stuff.
You mentioned Smash Mouth up top in the book. One of the first chapters is Only Shooting Stars Break the Mold.
Yeah, it's the first essay after the introduction. It's about Smash Mouth, the dot-com bubble, and spending time in San Francisco with my family as a kid.
We always talk about this 20-year nostalgia cycle, but I never realized that that's what Smash Mouth was doing at the time with 60s and 70s music.
Yeah, yes, right. And I think it's also worth talking about because it was not just them. There's this whole aesthetic. Oh, it's called Groovival. It's the Groovival aesthetic, which is like lava lamps. And it's basically like an update of the 60s for the 90s, which it is the nostalgia cycle. But I also think you can't understand the ascendance of Silicon Valley that happened in the Y2K era and a lot of the discourses and political culture without understanding the Bay Area counterculture and how that transpired in some, let's just say, interesting directions.
Yes, there's a certain type of guy that keeps coming up in your book, which is the aging boomer, whether that's Howard Schultz, Steve Jobs, the aging California West Coast boomer.
Aging
certainly.
West Coast boomer who, and it's, again, let's also clarify, white. This is a specific white guy and usually comes from the middle class or even sort of working class. But then during the mid 20th century, back when you could be working class and go up to upper middle class or higher, ascends and then is like, hey, you know, all of that peace and love stuff, fuck that. I care about my stock portfolio.
Yeah, the returns on peace and love just aren't doing it now. So.
No.
But yes, the main thing we want to talk to you about today, and I think something that we both really dug about your book, is Y2K aesthetics.
Yeah.
Which I know doesn't translate perfectly to an audio medium, but I believe in our
Google
capacity.
Google it. Actually, don't Google it. Don't Google it anymore because, as I talk about in the book, Google ruined itself. It sucks now.
Yep.
I would actually recommend going to the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute, which is a collective of basically self-funded archivists who categorize late 20th and early 21st century consumer aesthetics, whether that's design or advertising or products, fashion. They were an invaluable resource for me in writing this book and thinking through a lot of these categories.
I love that website a lot. I use it quite frequently. And I'll say to the audience, too, that if you're indifferent between listening to this on a podcast player and YouTube, I might recommend that you use YouTube for this one because I'll try and put a visual reference in for what we're talking about. Because Colette's main thesis in Y2K, How the 2000s Became Everything, we had this vision of the future that was so optimistic. The internet's being invented. We're seeing a limitless world in which technology will sort of fix our problems and blend seamlessly into our lives. And we're seeing over the course of the decade, towards 2007, that all of that optimism is going straight into the dumpster. We're going to see a fairly pessimistic outcome for all of this and contributes to the state that we live in today. And so we're going to explore that thesis through the aesthetics of the era of the decade as they move from 2000 to the end of the decade. So let's just talk a little bit about Y2K Futurism because it is a specific aesthetic style that has a label and description. I was trying to talk to people about this week and they were like, oh, that's like whale tails and what people are wearing now, like bucket hats. And I'm like, no, there's a specific aesthetic called Y2K Futurism. And it has these characteristics that are formalized at this point. It's characterized by slick, futuristic, metallic, computer-generated shapes. Apparently, something that was invented by the UK rave scene in the late 90s and popularized by people like the Spice Girls. Think about bubbly letters, tight leather pants, shiny clothing, silver eyeshadow, spiky updos, Oakleys, gradients, translucents. There was this sense, I think, that technology was getting better and people were starting to dress like they were on a spaceship.
Yes, no, exactly. Because there's this idea that was happening throughout culture and sometimes even explicitly articulated as such by commentators that we had entered a post-physical world and that we were all just going to live online, and that not only were we all just going to live online, but this was going to be a kind of utopia. This was going to bridge the differences between different cultures, between national borders. It would also create limitless wealth, was the implication, that basically we could somehow all have as much total abundance through cyberspace somehow. So yeah, it was this really peaceful, optimistic aesthetic.
Yeah, and I love that reference you make to Techno-orientalism, this idea that Y2K Futurism had blended motifs from all over the world. The globalization that was happening to our supply chains and economy was also taking place in our optimistic vision of the future. You mentioned Gwen Stefani wearing the jeweled bindi. There were a lot of uncles in this era, including many of my own, getting getting Chinese
absolutely
characters tattooed.
Right. The two things that uncles would get, not mine, but it sounds like yours would get, or your cool divorced older cousin would get, would be like Chinese characters, Japanese characters, quote unquote tribal tattoos, which were basically inspired by Polynesian types of traditional tattooing. And yeah, it was just sort of this look of, hey, the Cold War is over. It ended in 1991. We've got globalization in our supply chain. We're all doing world peace now, right?
It would have been so funny for my Uncle Greg to have articulated it like that to me.
How did he articulate it to you?
I mean, I'm sure he was just like, yeah, it's freaking strength in Chinese.
Yeah. And of course it says like idiot.
But it was funny if he was like, well, you have to understand the new neoliberal order means a globalized uniform society.
Exactly, right. Whose common language is finance. But another really good example of this would be the Y2K dragon motif, which was super popular. So I'm going to do a panel at McNally Jackson on the 9th. And I'm going to be wearing this vintage skirt I have from the designer Vivienne Tam. And it is a black velvet skirt, and it has these two huge red dragon motifs, which is also that type, the dragon thing. Cisco, people. Cisco was obsessed with the dragon. One of his albums, his big one with Thong Song, was, I think, called Return of the Dragon. And then he would constantly be photographed with his silver hair and then these jackets that had dragons, or just other clothes that had giant Chinese style dragon embroidery. So that was huge at the time.
Well, I mean, 2000 was a year of the
dragon. It was
dragon.
a year of the dragon. That's right.
No way, really. Wow.
It really was.
I had to Google that.
No, it really
now.
was.
I didn't have that at the top of my head. Yeah.
So that was part of it, but I think it was also this globalist aesthetic. Oh, and then you had belly chains. Alia loved to wear belly chains. I mean, a lot of celebs wore belly chains at the time. There was also, within kind of American style, there was a lot of white wearing of cornrows in different contexts. Yeah, whereas now I think that we all cringe at. But at the time, it was just sort of more generally accepted.
Speaking of people with awful tattoos, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who made National Truth and Reconciliation Day, he made it a thing, and then he skipped the first one to go surfing. He has some tribal tattoos, which is incredibly on brand for a neoliberal politician like Justin Trudeau.
No, it's so on brand, especially for a Gen Xer, right? Because the people who were getting this were generally, I think, not millennials, because we were too young. It was Gen Xers who were doing this, or aging boomers who were having freakouts because they were hitting retirement age or nearing it.
I think one of my favorite examples of this in sci-fi is the way that Firefly has both Chinese and English fused together into its global world government or whatever.
Yeah.
Just on this techno-futurism aesthetic, I loved translucent technology at the time.
Oh,
like
God.
the video game controller that you could see through. I had a translucent Game Boy.
Yes.
And I do think that this is wrapped up in this phenomenon that you identified, Colette.
Absolutely.
Where technology is inviting.
It's inviting.
Come on in.
Come on in.
We got nothing to hide.
Right. It's like, it's saying aesthetically, hey, yeah, we got nothing to hide. Technology is not going to create a dystopian spying realm where your phone listens to you and then transmits information to various government contractors, as well as data brokers who then sell it to different places that send you immediately creepy ads about the thing you were just talking about. No, technology, literally, it's going to increase transparency, and it's going to be beautiful, and it's going to be fun.
Think about your Game Boy. It's got these rounded edges. You can see into it, right? You can see it, but it's not recording data on you.
Yeah. Think about the guy at Google who had to take down the "Don't Be Evil" sign.
I think about that all the time. Yeah, in case people don't know, Google, I don't know when they took it down, but one of their prime directives was "Don't be evil." And this was very much a part of this post-60s Silicon Valley ethos of, hey, big tech, it's a net good in the world versus a net neutral, or in fact, actually a net evil.
I was just going to say, on this note of Blobjects, my personal favorite aesthetic from the 2000s is Frutiger Aero.
Yeah.
I went out as Frutiger Aero for Halloween this year in a costume that I made. And it's, again, this form of optimism and aesthetic where we're saying technology is actually going to be seamlessly integrated with the environment. Mm-hmm. It's going to live harmoniously side by side. And if you are thinking of some examples of this, imagine the Windows XP sort of look to it. You know, the background of the rolling green hills. It's often got bright, vibrant colors, usually green and blue, glossy textures, cloudy skies, tropical fish, water, bubbles, glass, lens flare. This idea that we have this beautiful, idyllic environment and high-tech imagery living side by side. I'm generally not a fan of its successor, Frutiger Metro, which is also very recognizable. It replaces a lot of the greens and blues with pinks, blacks, purples, orange, and then replaces the technology with musical symbolism. And I think part of that is just that we're not in the nostalgia cycle for Frutiger Metro yet, because that was sort of end of the 2000s, but maybe give it another 5 years and I'll be like, damn, I love Frutiger Metro. I want to be that for Halloween.
Colette, you talked about the presence of aliens in everything.
Yes.
And I love this part because we got the X-Files, we got Men in Black, we got Independence Day. Aliens were on our minds in the late 90s, early 2000s.
They were on our minds.
What is your explanation for the prevalence of aliens? Because I have a take also,
Yeah.
but I'm interested on what you think.
So the late 90s was interesting in that there's sort of a closure of the frontier in the sense that the Cold War was over, but also there was an opening of the frontier with the internet. That was a kind of frontier. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but I think you can't understand the Y2K era without understanding the dot-com bubble, specifically not just in terms of how it worked technologically, but how it worked financially, how it was literally a gold rush. And so 1991, the internet starts, which I think a lot of people forget. It hasn't been around forever, Zoomers and alpha people. No, the internet opened to the public in 1991 with one website explaining what it was.
Porn? Was it a porn
It
site?
was not a porn site, but that would probably be the second website, which I do talk about a lot in the book about how porn and the internet had a mutually beneficial relationship in terms of technological development. But so you had one website, and then I think by 1994, there were like 3,000 websites, but it was still like this toy. So it would come from actually a military program called DARPA. It was developed in the 60s through the 70s, 80s. And then you had Usenet, which is a precursor. But again, it wasn't this thing that just anyone could easily get on. And so you had this thing that was like, oh, this is this funny toy. It was not seen as this thing that would totally revolutionize our psyches and the economy in our daily life. It was just sort of like, oh, I guess I'll put a really crappy website that says, hi, it's the Smith family. And it's a picture of me and my kids. And then it has fun facts that you can barely read because they're yellow writing on green background. And all the pictures, it takes 5 minutes for each photo to load.
If we had ads, now would be a perfect time to do a Squarespace ad read.
Oh God. Yeah, you guys have to get on that. But yeah, no one really knew what to do with it and certainly didn't really know how to make money with it. And then in 1995, in August, actually, the day Jerry Garcia died, you had the Netscape IPO, and Netscape was a browser company, and they went on NASDAQ, and then they just set records and basically in terms of how much they made on their first day. And that was, as one journalist described it, the starting gun of the dot-com bubble, because what it basically said was, hey, everybody, this is a place you can get really rich, right? I know you thought it was a toy. I know you thought it was a passing fad that everyone would forget about in a couple of years and move on, like laser discs or something, or beta cassettes. But no, this is a real moneymaker. And by the way, I just want to add that Mark Andreessen, he is a Trump supporter. He's a billionaire who's constantly tweeting on X about wokeness and these types of things. And he did officially back Trump this past year. So he became very, very wealthy. And that's how he got his start. And then he went on to start a major venture capital firm, Andreessen Horowitz, which provides a lot of seed money for startups. And anyway, so 95, you have the starting gun.
New Frontier just dropped.
New Frontier just dropped.
Yeah. Gold Rush in California. We're running it back.
Yes, yes. Talk about the nostalgia cycle.
1860s nostalgia.
Yeah. And so by 97, things are really heating up. By 98, 99, things are on fire. Literally, the Dow in 1999 breaks records.
March 29th, 1999, traders passed out hats on the floor that said Dow 10,000. New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani and the New York Securities Exchange Chairman Richard Grasso wore them when they rang the closing bell. 1999 goes into the record book on Wall Street. Nothing bad will ever happen to us.
And then the previous year, there was a guy he was an MIT professor, and there's this quote I found, and he's an economist, and he said, "We will never have another recession again." and that the economy will keep going up forever. He literally said this. It was just crazy. And actually, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who's an arch libertarian, was actually surprisingly kind of had a note of, let's just say, he kind of kept it real when a lot of other people weren't. And he called this irrational exuberance, which is basically like, hey, calm down. Like, you know that there is such thing as a business cycle, right? But yes, you just had this crazy irrational exuberance. You had this gold rush in California, New Frontier just dropped. And by 98, 99, you had all these really high profile IPOs. You had these companies like you had drcoop.com, which got hundreds of millions of dollars, which was a website with health information run by Reagan's former Surgeon General. And
Jesus.
So that was getting like hundreds of millions of dollars. Or you would have eflus.com, which was a site that offered non-cash tokens that you could redeem at different stores such as Tower Records.
This is still happening too.
It's
I don't know if you
still
saw the headline yesterday that Fartcoin is now worth $800 million, which I noted that, okay, so if you take the combined market capitalization today of Denny's, IHOP, and Applebee's, it is less than Fartcoin. The useless cryptocurrency that does nothing. Ben in our episode said something like, capitalism is perfect and makes sense. And it's like, which one of these provides more social good? IHOP, Denny's, and Applebee's, the middlebrow empire, or Fartcoin? Fartcoin represents more capital. Don't forget, capitalism, perfect system. It just knows how to allocate resources perfectly.
I agree. Yeah, I just think...
And Dr. Coop.
Yeah, Dr. Coop, Fartcoin. That's what we need. Yeah, and then, of course, the famous one is pets.com, which was actually not a bad idea. And Malcolm Harris has basically written in his book Palo Alto about how the problem with their business plan was just that the logistics didn't exist yet to properly distribute things. And if they had come out a few years later, they actually probably would have done pretty well. But so pets.com is kind of the classic cautionary tale. They shelled out a bunch of money for a float in the Macy's Day Parade of 1999. Then in February 2000, they shelled out a huge amount of money for a pets.com Super Bowl ad. And their mascot was this talking dog sock puppet. And it was voiced by comedian Michael Ian Black. And then about a month or so later, the .com bubble starts to deflate in March 2000. And pets.com ends up folding. And then by 2002, basically pretty much all of the .com wealth, well, not all of it, but a large amount of it had been erased. And so these people who seemed to get rich overnight, they lost some or all of that wealth.
But back to aliens.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
My theory for the prevalence of aliens and the aesthetic is wrapped up in both this techno-futurism and this endless frontier and endless growth. We call it cyberspace. I think, yes, and I think it's also wrapped up in some of that 60s nostalgia and some of the fact that the boomers all remember the moon landing. Because I'm thinking about like actual space news of the 90s, because I'm a bit of a space dork. Yeah, I guess the International Space Station starts to go up, and that's international collaboration and SpaceX technology and whatnot. But I feel like this is an era when the shuttle program is starting to shake a little bit.
Yeah.
They're going up less and less. So I feel like there's not a lot of actual pivotal space exploration moments in the 90s other than starting to put up the International Space Station. But you do have, like you were talking about, the nostalgia around lava lamps. I see aliens and I think 60s space program a little bit.
You know, I never thought about that, but that actually makes a good amount of sense to me. I am inclined to say that I think a big part of the aliens is the frontier. It's what is space? Space is a frontier, you know?
The final
frontier, seemingly.
Yeah, Ben and I did an episode on 2000s Westerns where we talked about the same sentiment that Americans, we're not a big fan of limits.
We hate limits.
Limits bad. And so both space and the cyber world offer a potential escape from the hard reality of actual limits, of scarcity.
No, totally. And actually, there are a couple of things that made me really come to this conclusion. So one is there's a book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture by I think, sociologist at Stanford that, is fairly critical. but is also a pretty thorough look at this trend that we talked about earlier. And actually, there was this passage he had found from some cyber libertarian countercultural manifesto in the late 60s, early 70s that referred to ARPANET as the Western frontier. And it recasts someone who's in cyberspace as a cowboy. The phrase I can remember is the cowboy sits around a digital campfire smoking loco weed.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is part of the insidious genius of the Frutiger Aero aesthetic, bringing it back to tech and environmentalism. Like Giordano, you were saying, it seamlessly integrates technology and rolling hills and tropical islands. These two ideas aren't mutually exclusive. Meanwhile, how much power are we burning for AI to make the world's shittiest art and the plagiarism machine? How much energy are we burning for crypto, right? How much energy was burned to make Fartcoin happen? I vaguely remember a story about El Salvador going all in on crypto, and they were using geothermal power from a volcano to power their crypto mines.
That's Frutiger Aero, if you ask me.
No, we have an aesthetic that integrates technology and environmentalism. It's called solar punk, and it involves going slowly. It involves degrowth and not 2-day Amazon deliveries.
So let's move on towards some of the mid to late 2000s aesthetics, because one thing I loved about your book was talking about how the war on terror and the Bush administration and 9/11 maybe having this very real influence on the aesthetics that we chose to popularize in the United States. So you talk about this moment after 9/11 where George Bush tells America that it is their civic duty to go shopping right
Take trips
afterwards.
to Disney World.
Yeah, keep going to Disney World, right?
No, he said get down to Disney World. Or else.
Or else the terrorists win.
Correct. That is really how people talked back then.
Yeah. I love the 2K1 aesthetic, which has this very patriotic twist. It's people dressed all in denim with American flags. You mentioned that the Get This Party Started music video, which comes out in October 2001, features a singer riding a construction elevator draped in the American flag. It just like sort of immediately becomes part of things like music videos and fashion.
Right. We can't have any media that doesn't have the American flag because somehow that is disrespectful to the people who were killed on 9/11, which I would recommend anyone who wants to learn more about this to read as well Richard Beck's book Homeland. But yeah, it's pretty infantilizing, which he talks about, and I agree.
Yeah, my favorite example that you gave too was how Rage Against the Machine, we can't have that on the radio anymore.
Anti-American.
That's only for Guantanamo Bay. That's where it can be played.
We can't have it on the radio anymore, but we can use it to torture people. Which, by the way, in case people don't know, a thing that they did was sound was used as torture. So music would be played at super high volumes for hours and hours to torture prisoners to get them to talk at Guantanamo and at black sites across the areas that we had invaded. And to be clear, this was Rage Against the Machine, who I believe actually had filed a complaint about this because they did not want their music used in this manner, but also popular Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera. Drowning Pool's Bodies was another one that was popular to use as torture.
Yeah, lots of new metal, some Limp Bizkit
very
in there.
Aggressive. Right. And then actually the reason why Christina Aguilera was used was because it was a lot of these detainees were Muslims, and this is very sexual music.
Everyone talks about how 9/11 changed everything, right? And you nuance that take a little bit in terms of you see two chapters of one era between the optimism of the first chapter of the Y2K era and then what comes after. Explain that thesis for our listeners.
Yeah, so a lot of people say that 9/11 changed everything. That's pretty much a cliche at this point. And it was actually at the time a cliche. Even within a week after the event happened, there were people writing, "This marks the end of postmodernism. This is a new chapter for America." Entertainment Weekly for October, they just had this cover that was just the American flag, and it was like a new chapter or something like that. And I just don't think that this is true. Because the thing that I really remember changing was the type of culture. There was a lot of talk right after 9/11 about, hey, you know how we've spent the past few years just being super focused on materialism and shopping and consuming media and not really considering what really matters in life. And look, I love shopping. I'm not trying to knock it, but there are other things that matter in life perhaps more. And there's this idea that we would have a real moral reckoning in a sense after after 9/11, and that just didn't happen. What happened was that it was like, no, we're still going to watch music videos all the time, but not Rage Against the Machine music videos. And also all the music videos are going to have American flags in them. And also we're going to make the song, I'll Put a Boot in Your Ass, It's the American Way, very popular. And we're not going to listen to those traitorous Dixie Chicks because they made a mild criticism of George W. Bush at one concert in London. And so it's really the same focus on consumption and pop culture. Again, and I'm not one of these bores who's like, oh, consumption pop culture is bad, but I do find it a little specious that this was a marked difference.
The core values remain
were the
same.
It was just that the aesthetics were different and maybe some of the messages were different. And in fact, worse, because a lot of the messages were fairly jingoistic and stupid and xenophobic and like, oh, America's number one. And it was really an insult to one's intelligence.
Before 9/11, consumerism and acquisition are good because prosperity is good. And after 9/11, consumerism is good because it's patriotic.
Because it's patriotic. Exactly.
But the underlying notion of neoliberal capitalism that acquisition is good remains.
Yeah. Totally. And it's not until 2008 that I think that gets challenged. And the reason that it gets challenged is because people's ability to consume is challenged, because that was such a massive meltdown and so many people lost their homes, lost their savings, lost their jobs. Basically, so many people were in this position where they had to cut back and they could not consume as they used to. And I think that it was that actually provoked a reckoning of like, gee, maybe we should rethink this.
And one of my favorite personifications of this new era of consumerism or new aesthetic of consumerism is the McBling aesthetic, which you mention in your book. It celebrates aspirational luxury. Conspicuous consumption is at the forefront of McBling, I think, and it's trying to take something that's highbrow and making it as flashy as something that's lowbrow. The McBling in the name, the Mick is saying that it's like fast food, it's cheap.
And anyone can have it too. That's the other thing. And I do think that it's worth noting that the McBling aesthetic, it got big as the housing bubble got big. And then it pretty soon after the recession, it kind of went out of fashion. Yeah. So McBling, for listeners, McBling is think any picture of Paris Hilton from the 2000s, where it's a juicy tracksuit, a Von Dutch trucker cap, a huge logo Louis Vuitton bag or belts with logos, shirts. Everything has like a giant logo,
Yes.
like a giant Versace sunglasses. You have your heavy spray tan. You're driving your huge Escalade or your Hummer H2. Maybe you even have some rims on there. It's just really over the top and sort of really conspicuous.
Yeah, and I love that point you make in your book about how it was very funny to see affluent white people doing this performative consumption and being like, well, the fault of this is actually rap music. Like,
oh,
it's
no,
actually
totally.
their fault.
Totally. No, that was like a huge thing back then. And I think because we have basically spent since around 2014 or even earlier in this Black Lives Matter era where there's a real, although I think now we're in a retrenchment, which scares me, but there's this real, whatever you want to call it, let's just say like the BLM era. It basically drove this conversation and this reassessment in how people thought about race in a lot of different ways in America. And also this real consideration that, wow, I think of the Ta-Nehisi Coates cover story he wrote for The Atlantic in 2014, where he was like, look, the persistent racial wealth gap in America is because of ongoing policies that have accumulated over centuries, and this needs to be rectified. It's bad. And this was received, a lot of white people like me were like, oh yeah, that is kind of bad. Like that is bad actually. Whereas during the Y2K era, it was very much this idea that, well, because it's the end of history, all the problems have been solved. The civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, they fixed everything. Now we live in a meritocracy. And of course, because it's a neoliberal meritocracy, quote unquote, what that means is that there's an increasing gap between rich and poor, which is also racialized. And also you have the expansion of imprisonment in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s. So you have these roiling problems underneath the surface. You have welfare, quote unquote, reform in 1996, just kicked a bunch of people off of the little money that they got to support themselves and in many cases killed them. So you have these problems roiling beneath the surface, and then underneath and invisible to this narrative of, hey, everything's fine, things are going great, and we solved racism. And so we don't need to look to the past to think about how we can rectify present day injustices, racially or otherwise.
We live in an eternal present.
Eternal present, and the present is good. Pangloss was really having a moment in the Y2K era, right? Like, we live in the best of all possible worlds. And so throughout the book, I'm not a hardcore Freudian or a super expert or anything, but I do use a kind of Freudian analysis to look at how aesthetics and cultural practices can be a kind of hell of what's in the subconscious, including guilt or anxiety. And I think one way that came out was the way that a lot of affluent white people reacted to hip hop, right? And so, like, there was this whole thing of hip hop was this bugbear. Now, to be clear, this was also, for various reasons, this was the Y2K era maps onto what was called the bling era of hip hop, where you have really huge chains and diamond encrusted jewelry and spinning rims and all of this stuff. And you have like the classic pen and pixel album covers. And I think it was almost kind of like a winking thing and a self-aware thing, where it was like, if you look at the pen and pixel covers, they're funny, right? Like, and I think they're meant to kind of be, we're all having a laugh together, I think. But yeah, so you had this rise of hip hop into real the pop cultural mainstream. And then you had this hand wringing of, oh, gee, it's these shallow, misogynistic and homophobic and materialistic rappers who are causing these problems in America, rather than these people are reflecting these problems that already exist.
Society does not like to have a mirror held up.
Yes, it's a mirror.
Yes.
But I think what sort of happened was that there's this projection, this displacement of guilt that I think a lot of affluent white people maybe felt at some level. And it was this displacement. It was like, I'm not materialistic with my giant stock portfolio and my McMansion. It's those people. Or I'm not homophobic, even though I use gay as a pejorative adjective. No, it is rappers, right? It's Cameron's fault that there's massive homophobia in this country.
Right. I don't do conspicuous consumption, even though my McMansion is a disparate set of wealth signifiers that don't make any sense together.
In a house that's actually shittily built.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so I think a really good example of this, there was a lot of strange white fandom, and I'm not talking about what people called wiggers, for example, which I think was a derisive term for white people who actually genuinely had an interest in hip hop and hip hop culture. And in fact, in many cases had a class similarity. They were like poor white people in many cases, or maybe they weren't poor, but they felt like, hey, this culture and music, it speaks to me, or the fashion inspires me in a real earnest way. And so I'm not talking about this, but there's a specific type of thing which I see basically a kind of minstrelsy, where it would be a white person who doesn't normally represent themselves in this way, who would temporarily, as a joke, dress up in a quote hip hop style or whatever, right? And so an example of that, there was a white DJ called Da Pumpsta who had a popular dance party in Williamsburg in Brooklyn back in the peak indie sleaze era, where people would show up in tall tees, white hipsters would wear tall tees or fake bling and stuff. And sometimes people would even show up in blackface. Okay.
Jesus. Was it Justin Trudeau? Was he? Did he make a...
Maybe, yeah. He was the right age.
Yeah.
I think that looking at that, it's useful for kind of understanding things psychoanalytically, to look at white kind of hip hop, the feelings that various white people had toward hip hop at the time.
Do you make that connection in the book, neoliberalism and the hustler culture of bling rap?
Totally.
Which I think was chef's kiss.
Thank
Very
you.
much enjoyed that, seeing that reflected in the music as well.
Yeah, well, actually, I should just name drop. There's a professor at Johns Hopkins named Lester Spence. He's written a couple books about hip hop culture and Black political life, basically. And he has this book called Knocking the Hustle. And then he has another book called Stare in the Darkness. And he basically makes this point. So I quote him in the book, and it's worth reading if you like that part of the book.
Yeah, as we wrap up the 2K1 aesthetic, I want to quickly talk about transit and housing, two of my top political issues. Big urbanist over here. And you have a chapter on cars, you have a chapter on housing. Mm-hmm. And this is one area where I would love to point out a contrast to our listeners. listeners to try and hammer home what Colette's doing here. I feel like nowadays, if you talk to someone left of center about transit and housing, they will talk about urbanism, right? They will talk about ending parking minimums or zoning reform. Not even necessarily left of center people. Like, these could be YIMBYs here. But back in the 2000s, when we value consumption patterns and political action is demonstrated through consumption patterns, instead of being like, I want sustainable cities and public transportation and I want denser housing, what we had instead was, do you drive a Prius or do you drive a Hummer? And what kind of house do you live in, right? If we value consumerism and consumption, I want a big house with something Tuscan and something Mediterranean and something from some other part that recalls Versailles or whatever. And I think this is one major difference that we can see. The way that we talk about housing and transit is totally different post 2008.
I think that's true. Yeah. I think that it forced a reevaluation about these things.
And so just before we move on to sexism, I just wanted to close our aesthetics portion here by mentioning, we always like to talk about echoes in the culture, like where are we at today? And I think one of my favorite aesthetics today is vaporwave. Are you familiar with vaporwave? This aesthetic that is explicitly nostalgic for design that is sort of irrelevant now or out of date. Imagine using MS Paint from Windows 95 to make something beautiful. So where Frutiger Aero and Y2K Futurism are very forward-looking and saying the future is going to be so great, I think that one of the central tenets of vaporwave is we already have the technology 20 years ago to make things great. It is nostalgic for a future that never was. It's like a parody of art and consumerism, saying that we don't actually need better technology to make things idyllic. So moving on to sexism, when we talk about how the 2000s were different, something that comes up on this pod all the time is sexism is one of the biggest differences. There is a very aggressive, dark form of sexism that was, I think, a lot more apparent in the 2000s, a lot more mainstream. And one area where your book focuses on this a lot is on the concept of jailbait. Women who were under 18, I think that we spoke about them a lot more differently, especially mainstream news sources. I think the most striking example, which I didn't know about, was this David LaChapelle photo shoot of Britney Spears at 17, and she's lying on a satin bed, and the only object in the photo is a Teletubby.
I believe she's also on the phone, like a corded phone, and then she's also holding a Teletubby, and then she's wearing sexy satin short PJs. That's for children. That's for babies. This is grosser than the classic schoolgirl thing, because at least that's supposed to be, I guess, high school, which is still like, ew, but you want the women that you're sexually attracted to be like toddlers? I don't see myself as a prude, and I think a lot of the age gap discourse is fairly silly and infantilizing as well, but it's like, that's pretty gross. It's gross that the culture thought, oh, a picture of the biggest pop star at the time, and we're depicting her as a sexy toddler. That's not weird at all.
Nope. Yeah. The sexy baby thing is a joke normally that you make. You don't do it explicitly like that.
It was everywhere there. You had people who would wear shirts that said rat. I was in middle school, and I talk about in the book, I had a necklace that it was like a candy necklace that was like rat. First of all, I didn't know what that meant. But yeah, girls would wear rhinestone shirts and say baby, angel. Yes. It was very weird.
You coined the term, or use the term, hypersexualized virginity to describe these pop stars and kind of their aesthetics, to bring it back. So what's this mean? It means abs you can see, but it means the schoolgirl outfit. It means Britney Spears is wearing a purity ring and talking about saving herself for marriage.
Again, I'm not, and I say in the book, I'm not like, oh, we should all be sex positive, whatever that means. I'm skeptical of that. Or we should all save ourselves. That's ridiculous. I think that some people have religious or personal or whatever reasons that they want to have a more measured or constrained sexuality. Some people don't want that. But I think what really bothered me is this contrast where it's not just that, so you're supposed to be sexy, but you're not supposed to have sex.
Yeah.
And also the other thing is that it's always about service to men. Even the baby stuff, I think, is very much about that, because it's about, we don't want a woman that has sexy abs and knows what she actually desires sexually, or hell, even just has some kind of thought in her head. No, we want her to have the intelligence and complacency of a 2-year-old. That's weird as hell to me.
Yeah, we talked about this on our Paris Hilton episode where she talks about having done the baby voice on purpose to appeal to that that culture.
That was popular. And I remember people at the time would bully me because I have a low voice. And when I turned around 13, it dropped significantly. And like, this is how I sounded at 13. And people would be like, you're a man. Are you a transvestite? Which is, love that.
Oh my God.
Which is a very popular way to bully people at the time. It's just totally anti-trans homophobic.
I had the opposite problem where I remember in the 8th grade, this girl in my class, Megan, that I had a crush on, she called my house and I picked up and I was like, hello. And she was like, hi, Mrs. Is Giordano there? And so I had to pretend to get myself. I was like, just a minute. And then be like, hello?
Oh my God.
Yeah, but one of my favorite personifications of this 2000 sexist culture was this detail that you also mentioned in your book, which is that the Paris Hilton sex tape, which is a video of a teenager that was taken unconsensually of someone who was very drunk and released. It opens with the fact that it is dedicated to all the victims of 9/11, which is just an insane thing to dedicate a teenage sex tape to.
A revenge porn.
A revenge porn, right? This is
right.
And
yes,
this is
exactly.
the thing, is that basically all the sex tapes, there's all this talk about, oh, sex tapes, and it's like, well, basically none of the women whose sex tapes became popular wanted them out there. They're released non-consensually by either an ex-partner or, in the case of Pam Anderson, by a housing contractor who broke into Tommy Lee's safe.
I love your chapter on the modeling industry because it's such a great take. I think it was probably the take that I ended up repeating to my friends the most often. I was like, I'm reading this book. It's got this really funny idea that Larry Summers caused her eating disorder because you trace the timeline of us doing these horrible neoliberal reforms to ex-Soviet bloc countries, which ruined their economy so much that it impoverished the people, causing a bunch of very manipulatable, young, thin, white women to be present.
Essentially mined like an extractive resource.
Which that's actually from the British-Ukrainian journalist Peter Pomerantsev. He wrote a book and he literally says, with a good amount of the same kind of jaundice I have, that they were mined like oil. Listen, these are women, to be clear, we're not talking about, in all cases, 19-year-olds. We're also talking about like 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds who may not even speak English very well and go to these giant casting calls, and then maybe one of them gets picked, and in a lot of cases they end up in debt to their modeling agencies and they're trapped in Tokyo or New York or Paris or something, and it's really not a good situation for a lot of these people.
Yeah, and you mentioned that over 50% of runway models in Paris and Milan at the turn of the 21st century are from ex-Soviet countries. And yeah, they're perfect because they're desperate and indebted to the modeling agency and very young and don't speak English, and very few of them can advocate for themselves.
And very thin.
Very thin.
Probably, at least partially, because of all the malnutrition. Because, again, I think I've said this on the pod, I can't remember if I have, but worth emphasizing that the 90s in Russia are the largest peacetime drop in life expectancy in human history.
Yeah, I think about this all the time.
This is also part of the aesthetics at the time in terms of what is presented as the ideal body image for women is, yes, insanely thin, abs showing. I mean, Giordano has mentioned in the past, watch the music video for My Humps by the Black Eyed Peas, a song about having curves, and there is nary a curve in sight.
Right. Another one would be the paparazzi would be like, Beyonce has whatever, like a huge ass, basically. And it's like, whatever, she's a beautiful woman, but the idea that they would describe her as being super thick or something, and it was just totally ridiculous.
There's an episode of Entourage where Johnny is dating a woman who lifts weights.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire episode, the other guys are like, oh, well, you're gay. Like, you're actually a gay guy because you're attracted to a woman who has muscles.
Yeah.
Speaking of sexism of the time, Entourage.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so I found that chapter to be just so good, talking about how something like a political, socio-economic event like the fall of the Soviet Union can have this crazy higher order effect on fashion and culture and emotional anxiety. You describe neoliberalism almost as like it's a very slimming ideology, right? We're supposed to be cutting all the time.
Yeah, and it's all about regulating your own human capital. So what I also talk about in the essay is I talk about the effects of the neoliberal quote unquote reforms that basically killed a bunch of people in Russia and impoverished a lot of others and created people like Vladimir Putin, by the way. So I talk about that there, but then stateside, I talk about Natalia Vodianova, who I still find to be very beautiful and glamorous. But stateside, it's not just about the fashion magazines. It's about the messages that we're getting about managing our own human capital. And so I was getting very anxious in high school because I have a learning disability. I have dyscalculia. I can't do above 8th grade level math. And I was like, oh God, how will I get into a college? How will I support myself? I was really, really very anxious. And that sort of redounded ultimately into a couple years where I was first just starving myself and exercising 6 to 10 times a week, like at least once a day. I was really not having a good time there. And then it was binging and purging, and it was awful. I write in the book that it was like a prison. And I, then got some treatment, and I feel very lucky that I was able to basically get my life back to the place where I felt like it was my own and was not being run by this horrible thing that was in charge of me. And I really wanted to inquire, why had my life been so derailed? What was it that caused my life to be so horrible for those years? And especially because I knew it wasn't just me. I knew that I was just one part of a bigger trend line. And one of the things that I talk about is that I didn't have the words for it at the time because I wasn't really political at all. But what I was doing was I was managing my human capital. My parents, they're very good upper middle class professionals, and they would always talk about, oh, you don't want to have any credit card debt. You want to make sure to manage your money properly. And to me, that translated into, oh, well, don't want to have more than 1,200 calories, even though I'm literally running 11 miles for cross country some days.
Yeah, it all comes down to numbers, right?
It all comes down to numbers.
If we can quantify a credit score, and if we can
Yes.
quantify your net worth, and if we can quantify your debt, then there are numbers like calorie intake, there are numbers like
burning calories
burned.
with exercise. So I talk about in that essay, when I was a kid, I was very, very thin. And if you guys all remember, at the pediatrician's office, they would have a bell curve, at least at mine, and they would mark you on the bell curve. So I would always be on the left side of the bell curve as a kid. And then they would be like, oh, you need to eat ice cream. But then when I was in middle school, I basically became average. It's interesting because that didn't particularly bother me until I was very anxious about SAT scores and all of this. And if you know about SAT scores, those are also shown on a bell curve. And I was very anxious because with a bell curve, you want to be, of course, on the far right of the bell curve, except if you're trying to be thin, where you're trying to be on the far left of the bell curve. The thing about bell curves is it's a zero-sum game. It's not just you. It's you versus everybody else.
All against all.
All against all. And so to me, eating disorders of various types, there's something very neoliberal about them.
100%.
Let's move on to our last section, which we do in every episode. I mentioned our echoes in the culture. So how is this cultural moment of the 2000s felt today? How is it manifested in our current reality? And one area that I thought was pretty ripe here was you do a comparison of the way that liberals reacted to George Bush to the way that liberals reacted to Donald Trump, especially after his first election, where we're putting out these baby books like Goodnight Bush and Goodnight Trump and sort of comparing them and being like, this is an incredibly similar response to these two people, right?
Also embarrassing.
Yeah, more than anything, extremely cringy and embarrassing, because the main point behind a lot of that Bush criticism is Bush isn't bad because he's doing torture and he's killing 1 million people. Bush is bad because he's incompetent. He doesn't know how to speak properly. He's not meritocratic. He's stupid. Right.
He's Shrub. His name is Shrub, which I think Felix, if you guys have heard his new show, he repeatedly refers to George W. Bush as Shrub, which is a tick that certain liberals had during the George W. Bush administration. Because get it?
Like
get it? Bush, Shrub. Yeah, like the drum. It's stupid and it's infantilizing. And I do think that it does not fully reckon with the actual problems at hand.
Yeah, that was one area where in that chapter I was seeing these very, very strong parallels about how nothing has changed. We are kind of in this eternal present. But one of my favorite parts of your book had to do with all of the passages on hope, especially towards the end, about how the housing crisis happens and there is a kind of reckoning, whether that's in the form of millennial socialism or the body positivity movement or Black Lives Matter, or even just sites like Jezebel and Jacobin starting to crop up. It seems like very slowly and haltingly there is beginning to be an alternative.
Yeah, Ben, you mentioned this thing, I think, about like what will save us, right? Is it the media?
No.
Like traditional media, good luck. They were the ones who sold us the Iraq War. These are the things that are supposed to save us. The media, protests, and institutions. And it's like, okay, great. Well, the media sold us the war. We did the largest protests ever in 2003, which accomplished nothing. And the deep state is also postured as this thing that could save us. You see it with something like a shirtless Robert Mueller book, and none of these things having any actual effect. Another interesting echo in the culture, I think, is AI. AI, I think, is interesting because we talked about Y2K Futurism. We get the internet. Everyone's like, wow, New Frontier just dropped. We're never going to have any scarcity ever again. And there's this sense of optimism that comes with the new technology. And I found that the reaction to AI has been markedly different. That, like, rather than having this sense of limitless possibility with AI, I think most people have maybe learned the lesson from cyber technological improvements of being like, oh, we're not going to get the gains in productivity that this new technology offers us. It's not going to be evenly distributed to the people that it enhances their work. So I just think it was interesting, the different valence of optimism between the internet and AI technology, that capital is going to get the main share of this.
Yeah. Most people's reaction is this is going to destroy entire jobs and industries, right?
Right.
One of the things that gives me hope is, have you ever read Bill Bryson's book, A Short History of Nearly Everything?
Yeah, I love that book.
I love that book too. And that gives me hope in the sense that the cosmological timescale is so long that whatever happens here, we're all just on this big spinning rock. We're so insignificant in kind of the big scheme of things. And that I know that might sound bleak to some people, but that actually gives me a lot of hope because really nothing can actually last forever, even though it feels in a lot of ways like we're in this intractable moment. Now, of course, that's not saying like, oh yeah, things are going to get better in our lifetime. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to say they definitely won't, but I certainly am not going to say they will. I think anyone who is informed and is also telling you that they know exactly what is going to happen or not happen is kind of full of it. At this point, things are certainly not going well, right? And I think it certainly is a safe bet to say that in various ways they will continue to not go well for at least a while. But, you know, we ultimately live in this huge time scale. That gives me comfort and hope.
Nice. Final question before we wrap up the show. What role do you see nostalgia playing in society or moving forward or what have you? Because you close your entire book with a passage on nostalgia, but how everybody feels nostalgia partially for their childhood. But for millennials, especially, and the younger generation, there's a sense in which there were measurable ways in which our lives were better in our childhoods, that the world seemed better in our childhoods. What do you think the role of nostalgia is in our culture moving forward?
Yeah, first I would just want to talk about what the role has been for me that I've observed for millennials. I think that nostalgia serves a unique purpose in certain moments historically. I think that when there are these big negative shifts and eroding of quality of life or increase in social strife or environmental strife, various things, I think that nostalgia is a refuge from that. Because like I just said, the future is looking pretty grim in a lot of ways. Again, I don't know what the future holds and I'm not like, oh, we're all going to die or something, but hell, there's a lot of bad stuff in the present. There's a lot of terrible stuff in the present. So I think that this nostalgia for, say, millennials is unique in the sense of it's not just missing when you were a kid, which everybody does everywhere throughout history. I think that we're in a really unique position in that we were children and teenagers in this time when we were told that history had ended, all the problems had been solved more or less, except for little tinkering around the edges. There'd be endless consumption to kind of keep you busy. And then, of course, we came of age into this totally chaotic, crisis-ridden world with worsening climate change, with in the wake of 2008, with economic scarring from that, and then with various things that have happened since then, the political crises, the wars, and all of these various things that are going on and are kind of getting worse in many ways. I think that nostalgia is a refuge And it's kind of an anti-politics because it's like, oh, well, we can't really do anything. We can't make a better future. Let's just remember how great things used to be.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, so what's the actual release day?
The release date is January 7th from HarperCollins. You can pre-order now. Pre-orders really help. And then I'm doing a series of events on the East and West Coast. I've got tour dates. I'll be doing an event January 8th at Greedy Reads Remington Bookstore in Baltimore with Osita Nwanevu. I'm doing a panel at McNally Jackson on the 9th in New York with John Gans, Jeremy Gordon, and Vincent Cunningham. I'm doing an event, I think, on the 17th at Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Mass. with Moira Weigel. I'm doing an event on January 22nd at Skylight in LA with Emma Spector, Gabrielle Korn, and Helene Olin. And then I'm doing a San Francisco event with Joanne McNeil at Green Apple Books on the Park. And that is at the 24th of January. And you can go to my website, ColetteShade.com, or follow me on social media at Ms. Shade everywhere for more info.
Yeah, and there's an audiobook as well, right?
Yes, there's an audiobook, people. And I forget the actress's name, but she's really good.
That is such a smart decision, by the way, to get a professional to read the book. There's a specific author who will remain nameless because I don't want to cause a feud between myself and them, but they wrote a very similar book that they narrated themselves, and I don't think it was the ideal decision. But yeah, if you listen to this podcast, you are into the 2000s and you have very similar politics to Colette. And so this book is perfect for you. You should get the audiobook or pre-order the physical book, and I guarantee you will enjoy it. It's got so many essays on a bunch of different topics. I will be reading it again at some point.
I would double down. Yeah, I devoured the book. It was awesome. Check it out. Y2K. How the 2000s became everything. Essays on a future. It's
super confusing because it has two subtitles. So yeah, it's called Y2K, How the 2000s Became Everything, parentheses, essays on the future that never was.
There it is. Colette, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And as always, please like, subscribe, engage, comments, do all that business for this podcast. All right. Ciao, ciao.
Peace.
Bye.
Bing bing bum dum bum 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 bum.
What's going on?